Just one thing, Dave. Yeah. So yes, about the broadcast op certificate. Well, yes, I think I have got it. I got the general radio communication operators. It's a new thing they've just brought in. I used to have a first class, and then this thing superseded, and I did that. So that ought to cover the broadcast ops. Maybe I can look into that. I might look into getting a job in a broadcast station if nothing turns up in the shipping business, although I've got a chance of getting a shipping job next Tuesday. There's a bloke I know went to England for a holiday, and I don't think he's due back on Tuesday, and I don't think he's going to make it. Yes, that's interesting. I do remember Ray Lenthal, and he had a friend called Greg something or other, who lived just down the road from the school, and they were both great radio fans, and they used to build up things. I remember Ray Lenthal building up some monster of a superhead of a receiver, which was like everybody's first receiver, was full of dry joints and things like that, and we had to have a look at it. For the reason that you stated, Drew, I'm on 160 because they tolerate AM here. I've got a $70 Pi MTR1 here, which has got both receiver and transmitter in it. I operate it from a clapped-out car battery, which I charged from a battery charger, which cost me 80 cents to make, and I've got an antenna made out of flex from coal, and radials made out of an 85-cent roll of galvanised wire that I got from Woolworths. It's wire for tying up garden plants. It works until it rusts away anyway. So, I'm too mean, I suppose, to spend a lot of money on amateur radio gear, because I really believe what you and Dave believe, that electronics is a fun hobby, but you've got to sort of control yourself, because some people go mad with their hobbies and spend their whole life savings on having a super whammy DX kilowatt 4-side band.
I've got it written down, but in a
receiver so that they can one-up everybody else, and I just can't afford to do that kind of thing. I've got other priorities, so I'm operating. The reason really I'm on this band is I'm operating with fairly cheap equipment, and I've only got one crystal for 160 and another one for 80. I used to operate on the DX band when I was at Sandringham Tech. I used to have the call sign 3YC, VK3YC, and I lived in South Yarra then, and I had a Type 3 Mark II, and sometimes I used to operate it from the school even, I seem to remember. I used to work a bit of DX with that, not all around the Pacific, but it worked quite well. I used to have my DX time on CW, but I'm enjoying this business of being able to have sort of ordinary conversations with people. They're interesting conversations, and it's very good when you're bored and there's nobody around and there's nobody to talk to. You can come on 160 and you can have a conversation like what we're having now, have a most interesting time, and meet people that you haven't seen for a long time and things like that. It's really a very good band. It fills a great need there, because I'm sort of isolated here at the moment. I do see my friends from time to time, but I am in a slightly isolated situation, and this is very good to be able to converse like that. So I agree with what you both say, that electronics is a cold subject, and it's got its charms, and it's interesting, but it's not a thing that you can build your whole life on. Some people do tend to build their whole life on some kind of narrow technological expertise, and I don't think that's a good thing. I think there's more than that in life. And I did work in electronics for a long time. I have worked in building prototypes and fault finding and things like that, but it sort of makes you tired after a day of that. I can remember working in a factory making prototypes, and you spend all day with a bench lamp above your head, and you're looking into a chassis, and you've got the smell of rosin in your nose all the time, and it's sort of a great strain on the eyes. I used to come out feeling cross-eyed. It used to take me about an hour to unwind after a day like that, just constantly peering into some machine, looking at the bits of it, trying to work out what was wrong with it or put something into it. Can sort of wear you out. I've discovered since then, anyway, that there's a lot more to life. But it's quite legitimate to be wrapped up in technology when you're in your teens and your early 20s, because that's the time that you're learning, and it's fascinating. And you're very good at things when you're that young, and it's all new to you, and you're learning. So it's quite legitimate to be wrapped up in it then. But you do tend to sort of disentangle from it as you get older. Interesting, Dave, there that you have had technical school teachers in your family, and you know the temporary teacher scene. Well, I was in a similar situation when I went to school. I went to Swinburne Tech, that's where I did my secondary education, and that was during the war, and we had the same situation because all able-bodied teachers went to the war. They were all in the services, and we had a lot of funny old teachers who were all in their 50s and 60s who'd come out of retirement and sort of amateur teachers and people like that. So I was really caught in a similar situation. Some of them were quite good and some of them weren't, but I remember them with affection anyway. They weren't too bad. As for a sort of alternative ways to make a living, I think the further you get into this technological thing, the narrower it gets. The electronics industry has never been well known for being particularly well paid. It has always been a sort of an underpaid occupation because they rely on, to some extent, on young men doing it just for the love of it. They do too. They like the idea of working in some big organisation where they've got all this fantastic machinery, and that's the one way that they can get to work on it and to come close to it without actually having to own it themselves. And the young men do tend to have a lot of enthusiasm for that kind of work. But if I was a young man ago, I think I might learn to fly or something like that. You have to be physically fit for it, and it's too bad if you've got glasses or anything like that. But that's not that looks to me anyway to be an interesting opening.
For the millionth time, I know that there are IS number of comparisons to be made.
You can go and work in Indonesia, or you can go and work in the Pacific Islands, because they use those things in all sorts of exotic places if travelling happens to appeal to you, and it's also fairly well paid and reasonably independent. I think that'll be the sort of thing I might turn to if I was thinking about doing it again. What else have I got down here on the notes? Yes, you asked me what shipboard life is like. Well, shipboard life actually is a great pain in the arm. That's not quite the word I would use if I wasn't on the air. But it tends to be fairly boring. A lot depends on the ship that you get on. I have been on one or two ships where everything clicked and it fell together, but the coastal ships are pretty boring because you go on from A to B on them around the Australian coast, and the place you arrive at is just like the place you just left with the same customs, and there's not really much to do, and it does get to be a bit boring. But on the coast, well, the time you spend between ports is mercifully short, so it doesn't matter too much, and it happens to be well paid these days, and you get lots of leave. But the ships that I most enjoyed working on when I did work on ships were the foreign ships with foreign crews. I was on one once. It was a Liberian flag ship, and it had about 7 nationalities on it, and we got on very well on that ship. That was a very pleasant ship to be on, and I've enjoyed sometimes sailing with Spanish people and with Chinese crews. They've been interesting, and I used to sail a bit with the Greeks once, and I found that they weren't bad people. Many of the times you found the odd one that was hard to get on, but most of them were okay. One thing that was good about the Greek crews was that drunkenness is not a Greek vice. One of the problems when you're sailing on ships with Northern European crews is that there tend to be a few sort of mad alcoholics on board who can make life a bit of a pain. But anyway, the Greeks didn't have that vice. It's not a Greek vice to get drunk, so you didn't have to put up with drunks on Greek ships, and they are people who try very hard to make you feel at home. And when you go in Rotterdam or somewhere like that, and you go into town with the Greeks, well, you're their foreigner, and they won't let you pay for anything, and their hospitality can be overwhelming. And they weren't too bad. Their ships were pretty rickety. They used to say, "It's a broken, Mr. John." That was about all the English that a lot of them knew. It's broken. Yes, I know what you say about the research at the top not filtering down. I think it's just a question of economics. There's sort of places in the public service payroll for researchers, and they research, but what actually gets built in sort of mass quantities is controlled strictly by economics, and particularly now that wages are going up and sort of economies are being pulled in, and there's a downturn in the economy all over. We're not just not going to get things improved. I think that it's always been so that well, you sort of hear rumours that they can make an electric light bulb that'll never wear out, and socks that won't get holes in them, things like that. All these things sort of exist in laboratories, but economics prevents them from becoming widespread. As for amateur radio, the trend's changing. Yes, I remember when I was very young, I used to build receivers out of all sorts of old junk. They had 58s and 57s and 27s and 42s and things like that in them. It certainly doesn't pay to build your own gear. But electronics is getting very complicated. A lot of shipboard stuff is changing. Instead of having sort of a railway engineered simple equipment, they've now got things that are made out of cardboard and tin foil with hundreds of transistors, and they don't actually work any better. They're just more fragile, and they are harder to work on a rolling ship, but you've got to accept them because that's the way the industry's bent. But a lot of other good things have come out of it. I've got an electronic calculator here, which I bought for $6, and it's the equivalent of the old-fashioned mechanical adding machine where you punched in the numbers and you pull the handle and it printed things on a roll of paper, and it weighed about half a ton. This little thing I've got is the equivalent of it. I can stick it in my pocket and I don't know it's there, and I don't know how I ever lived without it. So we are getting some good out of it. And electronics is also getting a lot cheaper. I think they've given up the idea in Australia that the electronics manufacturing industry is viable here, because there was a time when you had to pay duty on transistor radios. You don't have to do that anymore. They've just recognised the fact that...
I might go and do some...
Have you written this out yet?
World in the United States or England or wherever you like, you get stuff with a local name brand on it. When you turn it upside down, you discover it was made in Japan or somewhere like that. The Japanese have just so far out in front that nobody's ever going to catch up with them again. Anyway, I won't rave on too long this over, because I see that everybody's voted to go to bed, and it's probably not a bad idea. It's pretty late. And although I'm a night person myself, I'll just nip up to 1850 and see Tony's still there. And he probably will be still there, but he's probably playing a tape or sound effects, and it's hard to get into the act, so I'll probably end up going to bed myself very soon. It's been very interesting talking to you both, and do ring me up and do come over and see me, Drew Diamond. I'd certainly like to see you again, and I'm very glad to have caught up with you. It's quite a surprise to me, but to speak to you tonight. I knew that name, Drew Diamond, when Dave mentioned it, but I couldn't quite place it. But please come and see me. I'd be very interested to see you. So their own country and their own manufacturing, and they're able to sell the things fairly cheap. Or the same thing's happening to us now. Our local wages have got so high in comparison to those countries that it just doesn't pay. I've seen a lot of things. There was a chap in Sydney had a boat building business, and he was shifting his operation to the Philippines. He said he couldn't compete here anymore. There were boats being made in Taiwan and that were brought out here that were very good quality and selling cheaper than they could be manufactured here. So he was going to, unable to beat them, he was going to join them and move his operation to Taiwan and just be a sales agent. A lot of people are finding this, but they're no longer in manufacturing, they're just in sales now. The manufacturing is being done somewhere else. So I suppose it's one of the prices we pay for living in a country with a very high standard of living. When you've got a very high standard of living, that means higher wages than other people have got, and that makes it very hard to export competitively. So what the lesson I read for myself from this is that I've got no future in Australia. If I can't beat them, I have to join them too. I'll probably ultimately have to go to Hong Kong or somewhere and start working for Japanese ship owners or something like that. If they're making all the dough, then I'll have to go to where it is, or go to Europe and start working for Arab ship owners, because a lot of Arab money's getting into shipping now. I hear there are jobs there on Kuwaiti flag and stuff like that, or even if it's got some other flag, a lot of it's got Arab money in it. So if they got the money, you've got to go and get some of it off them. That applies to the Nauruans here. We've got the Nauruans investing in this country, and they get a lot of attention here because they've got a lot of money to invest. So if there's no money around here, well, I have to be mobile. I have to go and find it. But I really think that you've got to, if you're an engineer now, well, you'll probably find that you're going to turn into a sales engineer over the next 5 or 10 years. That's about the size of it, I think. You said okay about Barbarella. Now, I saw that in the paper this morning, and I knew there was something I wanted to see on TV, but by the time this evening came, I'd forgotten all about it, or it got scrambled in my head, and I missed it. Now, I'm very sorry that I missed it, because I wanted to watch it, but it clashed with a couple of other things. I like that Vanishing World thing, too, so if it clashed with that, I'm probably glad I saw the Vanishing World, because they'll put Barbarella on again sooner or later, I suppose. But that's probably the first time it's been on TV. It's reasonably recent for a TV movie. No, I didn't read the education page on the Age, because I don't get the... Well, some weeks I get the Age, other weeks I get the Australian. I'm in my getting the Australian phase today, but I'll have a look at it in the library tomorrow. And every morning I go up to the Kew Library, and I pass it anyway on my way somewhere else. So I'll nip in there tomorrow and have a look at it and see what it's all about. As for contacting San Francisco, will you probably be better off to write to your son and get your son to do the canvassing over there for somebody to set up a sketch? He's probably in a much better position to find out than you are, because he's on the spot. I don't know whether he's in amateur radio or in radio at all, but anyway, he's sort of located better to do the thing. I think you said too that you were going to make a battery charger. Now, I had to make a battery charger for this battery that runs my equipment here, and they've got very nice ones in the local ironmongers for $26, and it's very cheap for what it is. It's well worth the money. But anyway, I didn't have $26 because I'm more unemployed than employed. So I made myself a battery charger, and I went into the city to that place in Middle Lonsdale opposite the other place, and they've got some rectifiers there. They're just a little silicon rectifier about as big as a large... no, it's not even as big as it's about 1/4 of an inch diameter by 1/4 of an inch deep. Anyway, it cost me 75 cents, and it will rectify 18 amps, so that's all the current that you need. And then I've got a radio transformer here with the filament windings connected up to give me about... Well, I've got the 5 and the 6.3 together. That gives me 11.3. Good stainless steel sink. I was going to visit a friend in Upway, and I was walking along the street, and I came across this beautiful stainless steel sink, so I picked it up and put it on my shoulder, and I carried it for about 1.5 miles, because this bloke was renovating his kitchen. It was just the thing he wanted. It was in perfect condition. I still don't know to this day why they threw it out, but the he who threw it out gave me the okay to take it, so he really didn't want it. People do throw out some good things. As for TVs, well, I was down at the Hawthorn Tip the other day, take a load of rubbish down there, and there were quite a lot of TVs tipped on the tip. I think a lot of these trade-in people, they don't even bother to put the traded-in TVs, black and white TVs, up for sale again. They just get somebody to take them to the tip. So if you live near a tip, well, that's a good place to go if you want to find stuff. So I think TV chassis are a great source of parts. You can certainly get a lot of things out of them if you're selective, and the transformers are very good. Certainly the filament windings are very hefty, although the HT was usually just a single 200-volt winding, and they used bridge rectifiers or something like that. So you'd have to have a couple of them to get, or even 3, to get sufficient power for a 600 volts for a transmitter or something like that. For battery charging purposes, well, they're ideal if you can if you can take the chassis. And the trouble with taking the chassis home is that you take off what you want, then you've got to throw them out again. But that's not too difficult. Actually, I used to get a lot of... I don't know whether I've told you this before, but when I was working in London, well, I used to be in London sometimes for 4 or 6 months at a time, and then go work again. Sometimes I used to spend the winter there. And the first thing I did when I got there was get a room, and then the next thing was to walk down the streets where they have these big steel boxes. They call them skips. They put them in the street. People put their rubbish in, then a special truck comes and takes it away. Anyway, it was in an area where there were a lot of flats where people were coming and going, and they used to hire TVs, and then they'd throw them out when they left, or I don't know why they got thrown out. But anyway, there was always a fine selection of TV sets, and I used to walk around and pick a good-looking one, and then take it home and fix it, and there usually wasn't much wrong with them. And then after that, when I had one going, every time I saw another, well, I'd have a plastic bag, and I'd pull all the valves out, and I accumulated a huge quantity, a great box of old valves, so that several of these TVs, I gave some away to my friends, and I always had enough valves to keep them going. So you can get a lot of good things for nothing, although it's tightened up recently. Now that things have got tougher, people tend not to throw out very good things. But with things like TVs, they'll throw them out because for non-technical people, the cost of fixing even a simple fault is quite high, and often it's worth more than the TV. And anyway, they don't know whether the fault's simple or whether it's not. If it doesn't go, it doesn't go. Thanks for reminding me about that disposals place in North Melbourne. I'd forgotten all about that. It's years since I've been there. I'd completely forgotten that. I must go there tomorrow and have a good look at it and see what they've got. Maybe I'll find something there that I'm looking for. I really had forgotten all about that. Yeah, okay about looking at books in those bookshops. Yes, I do a bit of that. I look at their books. But I don't take a pencil out. But for example, if I want to find out somebody's address or something like that, well, I go and have a look at that American Foreign Listings $18 call book. I never buy it. I just take a quick look at it and memorise what I need to memorise. I hope they're not listening. But a lot of those books are very dear. You'd have to be a millionaire to dabble in them all. Some of them are quite interesting. The pity they haven't got more of them in libraries. I suppose the WIA has got a library where you might find that stuff, but I'm only guessing there. I don't know just how extensive their library is. Okay, on the teletype, well, yes, I think you would have to get into a group to get the information efficiently. And I would be interested to find out more about teletype. It's something that's coming in on ships. It's something I should know more about, so maybe I'll go and get my hands on a teletype book if I can find one. Actually, that wouldn't be a bad idea. I know that motor speed control that you're talking about, they have those series motors with a centrifugal governor that makes and breaks a circuit. They have them on depth sounders, echo sounders on ships. I'm familiar with them. They're a bit of a pain in the neck. They've got a carbon ring. That's the sort of central component of them, and it wears away, and they can be a pain in the neck to adjust. You've got two sort of little weights counterbalanced by springs that fly out when the speed gets up, and if it gets high enough, it opens a contact. But it is a primitive sort of a thing. I think you're much better off with the synchronous motor if you can get it. Anyway, it should be quite interesting. I think they have teletype circuits over quite long distances. I've heard of people operating teletypes from the North Sea into Sydney radio and things like that, and they've got something called error correcting. I don't know what that means, but there is something called error correcting, so that they must have some device to weed out errors caused by stray bursts of QRN and things like that. I don't know how to get on. I think they work on a frequency shift principle, actually, so they wouldn't really have that problem. I think they work on frequency shift. They must clip off the tops and clip out all the noise, but I'm not exactly sure. But I know that you can hook them up fairly simply to an ordinary communications receiver. I remember working for the Red Cross once in Bangladesh, and while we never had teletype there, they used to use it sometimes when we had manuals showing how to hook up a teletype to the ordinary receiver, and it didn't look too difficult. It seemed to be quite a simple operation as far as I could see. I don't know what accessory you have to go with it. I got an idea they had a little sort of black box that went between the receiver and the teletype, but I don't know what was in it. I never really took much notice at the time. Yes, okay, well, thanks for the tip about the prices up there at North Melbourne. I'll still go in and have a look anyway. I may find something there. I saw those TV front ends down in Richmond, but I prefer to get the whole thing if I can with the ratio detector and audio and everything on the one board. I'll find a better quality circuit board of the same description. I'll get that going. I just need one for local reception, or an old TV set would do too. You could easily put a converter in front of an old TV set. I'll just tweak the turret a bit to receive on 144. I just want it for crossbands. I just need a 144 receiver here for crossbands. I don't think I'm going to transmit it. I don't listen on 2 meters, but you make it sound like the citizens band. They say there's no necessity for a citizens band, but if everybody's using it to say where the petrol's available and stuff like that, well, I suppose I could actually see a need for citizens band, a slightly more disciplined citizens band. I'm not opposed to, because the amateurs don't occupy the 10 metre band, the bit between 28 and 29.7. That's quite a bit of frequency, quite a number of channels there, but they can't occupy that, and neither can they occupy 11. It's just something that was flung at them because it's got industrial stuff on it. I really can't see any reason for keeping the citizens band people off it. I think there's more things for citizens band than there are against it. There's a lot of both, but there's a fair bit for it. It is useful for people calling for help if they're stuck without petrol or something like that. I can see a lot of positive uses for it. You may get a few ratbags who use bad language and carry on it, but I think the others would discipline them if they got themselves into clubs or something like that, if they had to pay a licence fee and have a call sign. Anyway, I think it's here to stay. It's like that other thing. It's here now. They've all spent their $200 on their gear, and they're not going to give it up, and I don't think fining them or persecuting them will do any good. I think it's better to get the $20 off them and give them call signs and let them go. Anyway, a lot of people wouldn't agree with me, but that's just what I think.
That was very interesting. Kevin, I've got a cold like yours coming on too. I felt it tonight. It must be going around. We have to put up with it. I noticed you were saying about the ships at sea starting early. All that's changed, you know. They don't keep those stupid watch-keeping hours on the coastal ships now. They start at 8 in the morning and go till noon in a one 4-hour watch, a non-stop watch. And then you go from 2 till 4 in the afternoon and from 7 till 9 in the evening, which is much more civilised than it used to be with that 2 hours on and 2 hours off business, because the 2 hours off was absolutely useless. You couldn't sleep, you couldn't get anything done. You'd just unwind a bit and you'd be back on watch again. And I always remember that very last watch on the coast that ended midnight used to be very tedious. It would be so noisy or so crammed with signals you couldn't read anything. And it used to sort of hypnotise me and almost put me to sleep, so I'm glad it's all over. That's what I used to like about freelancing on the Greek ships and things like that. I used to do 8 hours work a day, but I used to just arrange it to cover the periods when I could work the stations that I had to work, and I used to shift it around a lot, and nobody cared. You know, you weren't stuck to this stupid, rigid British system. This new one they've got on the coast is not a bad compromise, but I still prefer to be freelancing and please myself to work at the times when what I was copying was coming through. You feel quite ridiculous if you're sitting on watch early in the morning and you know that at the place where the office is, where they're going to send you the telegrams from, well, it's still 5 o'clock in the morning and nothing's going to happen for 4 hours, and you're sitting there like a stuffed dummy for 4 hours, you know. And on those ships you've really got to work. It's really hard work to make the sort of long-distance shortwave contacts and get the traffic. So I used to do my 8 hours watch keeping and keep watch on 500 for mariners in distress. I hardly ever heard any, but I used to make it at 8 hours that suited me and let the auto alarm do it the rest of the time. And incidentally, those modern auto alarms are very good too. Sometimes they ring for distress signals in Hawaii and the United States and places like that. They're very sensitive. And another thing is you don't get a cup of tea anymore on board the ship. None of this business with a steward coming around and bring you a cup of tea at 10 o'clock and all that. They might bring you one in the morning if they have to, but they've got very independent and they're sort of pricing themselves out of a job. They've got so useless that it'll soon be economical to put in self-service sort of cafeteria style eating places and to sort of pre-cook the meals and heat them in an oven like they do for the airlines. I can see that coming in a little while too. Actually, some stewards are all right, but some of them can be very hard to get on with. On the last ship that I was on, the steward used to vacuum clean the carpet in my cabin about once every 2 months. And one morning he stuck his head in and went crook because there were toenail clippings on the floor, and he told me I must put down a sheet of paper when I clip my toenails, but the joke was they weren't my toenail clippings, they were there from the last bloke, and this bugger hadn't, I'm sorry about that, Inspector, or this person hadn't vacuum cleaned it for so long, or so the one before him hadn't, and that's the way it is these days. You don't get the service that you used to get. You still manage to get along, though, I don't know. But not on this coast, you don't get the service that you used to get anyway. Maybe you do where there's still got Indians and people like that. Yeah, well, now, about the newspaper business, well, yes, I did get a write-up in the Financial Review of last Wednesday. That's a week before yesterday, and that was very good. And then on last Thursday, some persons from the Sydney Telegraph came out and asked a few questions, and I brought the Telegraph here on Sunday, but it wasn't in it, but it seems that they have a different edition in New South Wales and Queensland, and the article was printed in the New South Wales and Queensland edition, but not in the Victorian edition, so I was telling everybody to get the Victorian edition. They all did, and they wasted their money. 25 cents, I think it cost. Anyway, I've written away to the distribution office in New South Wales to get a copy of this thing, but I haven't seen it myself yet, but it'll turn up, I suppose. Anyway, by this time my face will be wrapped around fish and chips and potatoes in all the Sydney fish and chip shops and greengrocers, I suppose. Actually, everything's very quiet. I've heard no more about it yet. I don't know whether I will or not. I got a letter from one very large nationalised shipping company to say that for the time being they were going to carry on as they used to, and that's how it's going to go with most of them for a while, I think. I think it's going to be a while before any of them actually break away. At least they're free to break away now, which they weren't before, but it'll be a while before they do it. It's like when you open the door for the budgerigars. They don't fly out of the cage at once. They got too used to being in there. About Dave, what's it, VK3 ASE working at Steam Radio, and you're down there at TV. I thought you might possibly meet if you're on sort of on outdoor assignments or something like that, but as you tell me, he's an operator there, so he probably doesn't get on outdoor assignments. And okay on the technology skill, yes, I think it's very necessary, but I do feel myself that I've been hopelessly left behind by modern technology. I hardly know anything about logic and computers and stuff like that, and when I was a nipper, when I was about, well, it must have been about 1942, when I was about 11 or 12 years old, I started buying radio on hobbies, and when I first bought it, I couldn't understand much of it. I used to read the DX page and stuff like that, and I couldn't understand too much. Then I built one or two things out of it, and then I used to like that thing, and I got very used to it. I bought it for years and years and years. I had stacks of it here, and I learned quite a lot from it. And I was in Sydney last year, and I was in a second-hand bookshop, and they had stacks and stacks of old radio and hobbies, and I bought one from 1939, I think it was, just when the war had started. It was very interesting to look back on it and look at the projects that were in it. It's real nostalgia. I just bought one to keep for just to sort of bring back those memories. It really does look weird. But when I pick up the modern one, it's turned to Electronics Australia or something like that. I can't understand what they're on about. It's got very commercial, I think. There's a whole lot of hi-fi stuff in it. Well, I suppose hi-fi is necessary, but it's sort of switched to hi-fi and switched to logic stuff. And there's hardly any communication stuff in it. Now, a few things, but not. It's the emphasis has gone off communication stuff and on to digital and logic stuff. And I did read it whenever I can find it. I suppose I could start again like I did when I was 11 or 12, and I could learn something from it. I suppose I should buy it. It's $1 a copy now. That's pretty dear. Anyway, I can read in the local library. I should go and try and read it, and I should build some of those things with the integrated circuit chips. I've got a bag full of them. I was walking around London once, and I found a place where they were selling plastic bags with 200 integrated circuits in them for £2 or something. So that was about a penny each. And I bought them, and I brought them home here, and I've got them all stacked away. I was sorting through them the other night. I've got some quite good ones there. I've probably got enough to build something out of. I ought to try it. Because you've either got to get into it or get out of it. You can't. It's no good. It's just no good being around with sort of crystal set technology anymore. Nobody wants to know about it. But it's very interesting what you were saying about the bloke with the blue glow in his valve. I can remember having a blue glow in a few of mine when I got to be about 14 or 15 or even younger than that. We used to build super hets, but we used to have some very weird bits in them, 27s and those old 47s. Remember the old 47s with the directly heated filament and the great big sort of pear-shaped bulb on them? Well, we used to get hold of those and run them, and you had to have a centre tap resistor on the filament because it was directly heated filament. And those funny old AK series valves with 4-volt filaments and funny sort of sockets with little flat pegs sticking out the side. They used to be in European receivers. I think they must have been. It was Philips technology, really. A lot of receivers that had Philips valves had that kind of socket on them. I forget what they were called, but they had 8 pins, but it was a funny arrangement with little flat bits of metal sticking out sideways that made contact on spring clips on the inside of a deep socket. And anyway, I used to get a few blue glows and a few of those. I've had a few 80s and things like that with red glows and blue glows, and there used to be the blue glow when there was gas in the tube. That was always bad news. You usually got it in rectifiers and things like that. But then there was the other blue glow that used to be a sort of a fluorescent shine right on the glass, and that was good news. That meant a high vacuum. I remember that all right. But, you know, this is all the things that I learned, and it's all obsolete now. It really worries me that I learned all this stuff, and it's all rubbish now. Nobody wants to know about it, you know. I'll have to probably work in the museum when I'm 68, getting things going that nobody understands anymore. I don't know the FRG7 receiver that you mentioned directly, but I do know the principle. I have seen that type of receiver. It's a very good system, and it sounds very cheap at that price in Hong Kong. But, of course, I don't know how you're going to get on with the customs. I think you're allowed to have one transistor radio, I think. If you come in with, you're allowed to bring in one transistor radio. It'll be a pretty big transistor radio, but you're still allowed to bring it in. I think if it was a transmitter or something like that, you'd be in trouble. You'd have to pay for it, but you'll probably get away with it because I think they've taken the duty off transistor radios now. They've given up protecting the local industry. They realise that it can never compete, and the Japanese are king in this business. And they've given up trying, so you'll probably get that in. That's a very good system. I must do something like that myself next time I'm up that way, if I ever get up there again. Actually, there's another receiver on the market here, a disposals receiver that goes in 1 meg steps. I think it's built by Philips, and there's one in the window of that shop opposite the back of our largest department store in Lonsdale Street. It's been there for some time. And it's a valve receiver, and it's in a very solid sort of steel box. I think you could hit it with an axe and break your axe. And I've seen a few of them advertised in trading posts too, but that bloke opposite the back of the largest department store is rather pricey. I think he wants about 300 dB for the one he's got in there. I don't think I'd pay 300 dB for it because I could get a new one for that. But I have seen the same thing advertised in trading posts. For something less than that, quite a bit less, and that goes in 1 meg steps, and it's an interesting looking thing, and it's got the speakers on the panel. It's all sort of covered in khaki paint, but the thing that got me about it was the 1 meg steps, and I think it's got a pretty good selection of selectivities too. I wonder if you know anything about the receiver that I'm talking about. Its code begins with R. It's R and a 4-letter number or something like that after it. But it's not the old one that used to be in Liberator Bomb. It's not that terrible old thing with the rainbow sort of half-moon dial. I'm not thinking of that one. The dial on the one that I'm describing is a little window about 5 inches long and half an inch wide with a sort of a roller-type scale that shifts around inside it. Yes, very good, Kevin. No, I've only been with Indian crews once, and all I remember about them was they were nice blokes, but they were getting screwed. I think they were getting £5 a month or no, it wasn't £5 a week, it was £5. I think it was £5 a month. It was in the 60s. It was incredibly little money, and it was a new ship. It was a Liberian ship, but it was a sort of an arm of a British company, and they got their Indians from India on the British system, and they had special Indian cabins with 4 bunks in them, and if one got out of bed, well, the others had to stay in. It was one of those deals, and they didn't like it, I seem to remember. They are nice places, but they do. By my standards, they get screwed. Although they say that the money they get's enough to send to their wives. I suppose it's better than starving. But they seem to be about the lowest paid of all crews, and the most docile and the most sort of accepting of it. And it's a bit sad, really. In some ways, it used to make me uneasy sometimes to work on those ships with very low-paid crews, because you'd meet them ashore or something, and you'd say hello to them, and you'd be in some place where everything was fairly expensive, and you could afford it, but they couldn't, you know. It cost them 2 days' wages for a beer or something like that. That used to worry me a little bit. If they drank beer, I don't know if they did. Well, I'd never been around at Ramadan, but I remember once I was in Bangladesh in 1973, I think it was, and that's a Muslim place in Dhaka, and they have a festival called Eid, and it's sort of like Christmas. And at Eid, everybody has to kill something. They've all got to kill an animal, and some can only afford to kill a chicken, and some of them kill a cow, and there's a special ceremony they perform with the blood. And I can remember going in a car along a road there where rich farmers just slaughtered a cow, and they were busy hacking it up, and they were taking a slash at its stomach, and then all the entrails fell out when blub, blub, blub on the road, you know. It looked pretty terrible. And I can remember seeing the same scene at the abattoirs in Melbourne, because in my school teaching days I used to go down there for bits and pieces. That was pretty terrible too. The only difference was they sort of did it behind walls. It wasn't public. Okay, about people who spend $2,000 on a lot of gear. Well, that seems ridiculous to me, because for $2,000 it's no good saying, hello, we're having nice weather, goodbye to the DX. For $2,000 I could actually go there and live among them for 2 months or something like that and meet them face to face. So it seems like a waste of $2,000 to me, but it's not very much. I suppose if you have the gear over a long time and you compare it with the cost of a used car or something like that, I suppose if you're sort of nailed down by 1 foot in Melbourne and you can't get out of it, well, it's good stuff. I suppose it makes it bearable anyway. But anyway, it's not my cup of tea. I wouldn't spend that money on all that gear, and I certainly agree with you. It was a lot better in the old days when you made your own gear and it actually worked. And I seem to remember that on the homemade receivers I had in the old days, I heard a hell of a lot more DX than I'm hearing these days. I used to listen on 20 metres on the weekends, on Saturdays and Sundays, and I used to regularly hear G's and all sorts of European and South American and North American and stations from all over the world. I used to hear the whole world. Maybe I didn't hear the 30-watt stations, but I heard the blokes who had 100 or 150 or 400 or 500, and I used to send away reports and get their cards. That used to be my hobby when I was 15 or 16. But I used to hear them, and I used to hear them quite well too on my homemade receiver. And what I've got now isn't really much better, but I just don't hear it. I don't know why. It doesn't work that way anymore. I remember those octode converters and things like that with the gold paint on them. I remember those Philips valves with the gold paint. There was one, I think it was called AK1, and it had A meant a 4-volt heater and E meant a 6-volt heater. And the AK1 was an octode converter, and then you had heptode converters and stuff like that. And then it was big deal if you had a 6K8, because a 6K8 worked better on HF, and then there was ECH35 took over, but that was getting fairly modern. That had octal base. On the spark transmitters, I've never seen one actually, although I can remember there were a few around in the 60s when I first went to sea. But I can remember when I was a kid, there used to be a magazine put out by the Army called Salt, and I had a friend whose father used to work at Victoria Barracks, and he used to bring copies of Salt home, and it had articles in Salt about how to make. It had all sorts of articles on how to get water when you're in the desert. I remember the system was you went to a dried up water hole and you dug, and you found these frogs that were bloated with water. And when the drought came on, they used to fill themselves with water and bury themselves in the mud. So you gave them a squeeze and you got the water out of them. That was one of the things I learned from Salt. And another one was you could make a spark transmitter out of a T-model Ford coil. And we used to go down to the car wreckers and get T-model Ford coils for $1, and I had half a dozen of them here, and I used to make transmitters out of them, and then we used to draw big sparks off them and get our sort of innocent friends to come along, and they'd point their finger at them, and then the big spark would jump out on their finger, and you could see it. It was about 3 inches long, and they'd get hurled across the yard, and everybody would fall about laughing. We used to have a lot of fun with things like that. I wish I had a Ford coil now. Even that'd be worth a few bob, but we used to think nothing of them then. We had lots and lots of them. On the old gear in the museums, yes, there is. I can remember my old man made a receiver, and it was in a cabinet about 5 feet long. It stood on legs, and it had about 4 stages, and each stage had its own vernier dial, and then it had a horn speaker and about 3 sets of headphones, and when you tuned it up, you'd have to run along and tune each stage separately. They weren't ganged, and it was regenerative, and you'd have to adjust the whistle and stuff like that. I can remember that stuff, and I can remember a lot of old commercial crystal sets being laying about when I was a kid too. And I've also seen those TRF receivers you mentioned, where the emergency receiver being a crystal set with a real crystal detector was built in the back. I've seen 1 or 2 of those about, I seem to remember. We are getting pretty old, Kevin, because we're actually pre-tape recorder. I can remember when the first tape recorders came to light. The first time I saw a tape recorder, it wasn't even a tape recorder, it was a wire recorder, and it was at the studios of Radio Australia, and it would have been about 1947 or 1948. And I used to know a bloke in there. He used to be in our DX club, and I used to go there once in a while. And he had this wire recorder, which was a sort of a piece of Martian apparatus that everybody sort of stood 6 feet back from. You would get one for $5 in a junk shop now, I suppose. But anyway, fancy that. Well, I'm pre-tape recorder. I can remember my cousin used to have a thing for cutting wax discs with a sort of a screw that drove the head across the disc, and these special wax discs. And when you'd cut the disc, well, you had to be very careful with it. You could only play it about half a dozen times and it wore out. I can remember that stuff, and they were on aluminium with a coating of wax on them. And I know what you mean about that old gear where you had motors driven from amplified sine waves that were converted from something else, because in about 1954, I used to be a draftsman for the PMG, and I worked on the first speaking clock, and the first speaking clock was like that. It had a crystal oscillator, and then the frequency was divided and divided and divided until you got down to about 60 cycles, I think it was, and then that was amplified with some great fat tubes, and that drove a synchronous motor, and the synchronous motor had sort of wheels on it, and the wheels had brass segments set into them, and every time it turned round once, it made contact on this brass segment. I suppose that's on the junk pile by now too, but that was a big deal in those days too. You could dial on the telephone and the voice would tell you the time. And I remember they got special glass discs with the voice recorded on it from Europe somewhere, and it was on that sort of old-fashioned principle that they used on the old-time sound movies before they put the magnetic strip on them, where you had a sort of a transparent material with a wavy sort of dark line on it. It was on that principle, and that used to do the talking. I remember that well. And what else have we got here? Yeah, and also I was talking about old gear. I was up in Rabaul in 1975. In New Guinea, and I know that up there there's a Japanese naval radio station they had in a cave up there apparently, and anyway the entrance to the cave got caved in by the bombardment, and they only recently opened it up, and they've got all these huge transmitters and all this Japanese radio gear that's been entombed in this cave for about 20 years. And in the middle of the town of Rabaul there's Admiral Yamamoto's bunker. It's a concrete bunker, and they've got some sort of souvenirs in there, and among them Japanese radio of the time. Now it impressed me as being very compact. It's valve stuff, but very, very compact. They had transmitter and receiver in a little case that was about the size of a sort of a pocket paperback book, about 6 or 7 inches by about 4 inches by 5 inches, and they packed quite a lot in there. And I seem to remember our own gear of that time was entirely different. There was a set, I remember, that was full of 1K5s. It was about 2 foot long and 18 inches deep and 6 inches thick, and only put out about 1/4 of a watt. I remember seeing that thing after the war. This Japanese stuff made some of ours look rather large and clumsy, but I suppose we're large and clumsy in comparison to them, so we could carry it around. Anyway, we won with it just the same, but the Japanese stuff was really good. I'll just make a couple of brief comments. The first is you're probably right about that Indian scene, because it's even worse if you go to India and you walk around and you see the people there. So I suppose you're right, even if the people are walking around picking up cigarette butts and they're getting 3 meals a day, well, it's a tremendous advantage for them. But anyway, it takes a lot of a sort of adjusting of the mind to get used to that kind of idea. You know, my mind just won't make the leap sometimes, but I think when I think about it, basically what you say is true. And the second thing I was going to say is about the Japanese transceivers I saw in Rabaul. No, they weren't a single valve one. They had about 4 valves in them, I think, 4 little valves, like about the size of those little of a 6V6 GT, something like that. They probably, I think it was built later in the war. I've got a vague idea that they were out of aeroplanes. They could have been out of aeroplanes. They didn't actually have cases on them, and they could have been out of planes. That's probably what it was. So they were probably a little bit more sophisticated than just the single valve thing. But I do remember well that English 19 valve, and I remember the first time I ever bought a valve, I was about 12 or something like that, and I wanted to build a 1 valve set, and I had to buy a 30 because the circuit I was using was in popular mechanics or popular science or something like that, and I had to get a 30. And you know how you are then. It's got to be the exact one that's in the book precisely. And I went and drew the money out of my school savings account where I put a penny in every Wednesday, and I had about £1 in it. I drew it out, and I had to pay 16 bob for this Type 30 valve, which I had for a number of years until I eventually dropped it. But then after a little while I discovered that
kids at school had cheap ones. You know, you could get funny old triodes with funny numbers on them and A149s and stuff like that, and I discovered where you could get cheaper ones after a little while. But in the beginning, I fell in that trap and paid the whole 16 bob out of my savings account for that valve. But I had a big hassle every night getting into a hotel. The hotels are cheap enough, but I always had this hassle getting a cheap room. They'd always want to give me a double room, the dearest room in the house. They'd always swear they didn't have a single room. And in the end, I ended up finding a little hotel. And there was the bloke on the desk at midnight was a young German. He could speak very good English, and he didn't mind speaking to me. And he'd always give me a cheap room without any argument. And then I went in there every night for about 3 nights, and he gave me the cheap room, and it was very good. And then the next night I went in there, the owner was there, and there was a French lady, and she'd swear they didn't have any cheap rooms in that hotel. And then the young German had come in, and he'd say they did, and then she'd look very embarrassed. Once I gave her a 50-franc note to pay for the room, and she was so embarrassed at being caught out about no cheap room, she gave me change for 100 francs. That's happened to me a couple of times in France, that people have given me too much change. They seem to get flustered when you catch them out in something like that. Anyway, they were very strange people. I never really got through to them. I can't speak French. I know a few phrases that help me along. But I just bought a very good street map, and I found my own way around, and I found my way around the metro system okay. And I didn't have any real problems, but not knowing the language, it can be a bit of a pain, and certainly in a place where the people are tricky and they're not very helpful. But I have discovered that in other places. But if you do happen to know the language and you can tell them what they're doing and what little trick they're up to, well, they leave you alone after that. I can speak a bit of Spanish. I don't have any trouble in Spanish-speaking countries because I can rap with the people, and you can sort of break the tension. It's really a tension. I think that's what it amounts to, because if you're sort of walking around and you're sort of you're walking around like a robot, the people can see you walking around, but they can't say anything to you, and they don't know what your business is. They always want to know what you're doing there, what your business is, and the tension builds up, and then they've got this compulsion to break it somehow. And one of the ways they break it is to play tricks with you and have a bit of fun with you, and that's one of the ways they break this tension. Well, you can get around it if you speak the language. You can tell them to get lost, or you can deflate them very easily if you can just shoot the right phrase at them. But otherwise they tend to torment you. That's what it really amounts to. They torment you because you're foreign. It happens here too, because when I was a nipper at school, it was during the war, and a lot of refugee kids were coming. I can remember there used to be kids at school, in the primary school at Glenferrie State, wearing lederhosen, these German leather pants, and funny clothes, and we used to torment the hell out of them just because they were wearing these funny clothes, and there was nothing they could do about it except punch us in the head if they dared, because they couldn't talk to us. But I haven't been in the situation of, I travelled on a train once in Mexico from Veracruz to Tapachula. It was a very slow train, and I was about a day and a half in this thing. And it stopped at every siding to let trains full of sugar. It was the sugar cutting season, and it had to stop to let these trains loaded with sugar cane go through. So it took us a day and a half to get there, and the carriage was full of Mexicans. But I was okay because I could say a few things to them, and I got quite friendly with them, and we cracked jokes and carried on, and that sort of broke the ice, And there were kids in the train, little kids about 5, and 2 little girls about 5, and I was playing games with them, and they were looking out the window and telling me that's a horse, and I'd say, no, that's a cow because it's got horns on it, and things like that, and then they'd ask me, why don't you comb your hair, because it looks very untidy, and it sort of breaks the tension. But if I'd been locked up in that carriage for 30 hours and I couldn't have said anything to those people, it probably would have got a bit heavy, I think. So anyway, that's a relief if you can do that. But anyway, the people in those countries are much more courteous and polite than the French are. I like the Spanish people. They've never done any harm to me. I've been on ships with Spanish crew, and they're not a bad people. But the French, I'm afraid, can be different. But there's one part of France where they're very nice, and that's round about Lorient on the Atlantic coast in Brittany, because there are different people there. They're related to the Welsh and to the people in Cornwall, and they play the bagpipes, and there are different people to the French, and they know there are different people to the French, and they can be very nice there. I went there once on a ship to Lorient, and that's where I bought my car, actually. I bought it in Lorient for $100 American at that time. It was one of those Citroen 2 CVs, and they didn't treat us too badly in that town. They were a different style of French people, so they're not all bad. But Paris is particularly bad. I remember going to that
Gere Nord station after walking when I wanted to shower, and you go into the public toilet there, and it costs you about $1.50 just to get into the shower cubicle. You pay about $1.50 just for the water, and if you want soap and a towel, you've got to pay about another $1.50, and then you've got to tip them as well. It used to be rather heavy, you know. I used to have to put up with it. There was nothing I could do about it. And I remember going to hotels at night. I'd be walking around, and I'd go to a hotel at night, and I'd get a room, and I'd pay for breakfast, and then when I came down in the morning, they wouldn't give me the breakfast. They'd say I hadn't paid for the breakfast, and if you wanted to use the bathroom, it was extra. They used to rip another $1 off you to get into the bathroom. They'd ceremoniously unlock the door with a key. And I remember staying in a hotel there last September, and I was in the attic because I couldn't get there was the tourist season was on, and you couldn't get in anywhere. And I was in this attic, and there was no lift in the building. I was about 6 floors up. It had a sloping roof. I could hardly stand up, and I was paying the earth for it. And it had a sort of a porthole that looked out over the sloping roof, and there was a notice in English and French and German behind the door about what to do in case of fire. And if there was fire on the stairs, you were supposed to keep calm and stick your head out the window and call for help. Well, all I could see out the window was the sky, you know, so it wouldn't have done me any good. I'm glad I never caught fire on that particular day. Now, having knocked Paris to that extent, I have to say that I like the city. It's a beautiful city. It's a beautiful-looking city, but it sort of wears you out because there's no seats. You can't go into a park and sit down on a seat. There aren't any parks that I can remember, maybe one or two, but you have to pay to get into them. I went into a park there, and I had to pay to get in. And about a 2.5 francs or something like that, about 50 cents just to get into the park. And there are no seats around in the streets where you can sit down and rest your weary legs. You've got to go and buy coffee, and it costs you, by the time you bought coffee for two, just to sit down and drink a cup of coffee, it's cost you about an English pound. And there's the great beer rip-off. I know that business about getting a beer in Paris. If you go into a humble little workers' bar or something like that, you can get a beer for about 80 centimes. But you go to some other places, and for some unknown reason, they rip you off for about 3.5 francs. You know, I think they've got a sort of a different scale of charges up. If you sit down and have your beer in a certain kind of a glass that's a certain kind of beer, and you've got to pay that kind of money. But if you just stand at the bar, it's 80 centimes. But they tend to let you stand at the bar and have your 80 centimes worth, but charge you $3.50 for it. They just enjoy getting the better of you. They're very nasty people in that way. And they used to annoy the hell out of me. It sort of gave me an incentive to learn French. I must go, and I'm still trying to learn a bit of it because I know that next time I go back there, I've got to be able to swear at those people. And I used to get the same treatment sometimes in Germany too. If you went into certain bars in Germany, they didn't like English-speaking people in there, and they would charge you, and they'd rip you off for the beer so that it would drive you right out of the place again. I can't say that I ever got very friendly treatment in Germany either. I'm afraid some parts of Europe, it's sort of dog eat dog as far as tourists are concerned. On the other hand, I suppose the tourists can be a bit of a pain to the local people. I remember when I lived in London, and the tourist season would come, and I'd be battling to get a room in a hotel. I'd have a room in a hotel, but it'd be booked the next night, and I knew that day I had to get out and find another. And then you'd see this Boeing 747 flying over, and you'd say, "Oh God, here comes another 483 of them." You know, more competition. In about 2 hours when that's landed, they'll all be in the market looking for a room too, and things like that used to worry me. It just gets overcrowded and exasperating, and I suppose they see all these tourist faces sort of peering at them, and they're clogging up the metro, and they're clogging up all the facilities, and all they can do is rip them off and get some money out of it. But anyway, it's not a nice experience to go through for the first or second or third time. You know, having been in and out of there a few times, I know how to handle it now, where to go and where not to go, but I still get caught a few times, and it really does annoy me. And I don't know how people live there. I think it's absolutely essential to learn a bit of French. But I never had that problem in Spain. The people always treated me pretty well in Spain. I got robbed there once. I went to Spain in my Citroen 2CV, and I used to have my, it's a very easy car to open. You could open it with a pocket knife or a tin opener. So I used to have my suitcase chained to the chassis, but I had a little record player there. I was carrying everything around me like a snail. And anyway, I offended some shoe shine people because I wouldn't let them shine my shoes. So to get revenge, they ripped off my record player, but I didn't consider it such a loss. But it was pretty good. They never treated me badly. And at least one of the problems in France is eating. You can go into those self-service places in in Paris, and for about £2 you can eat reasonably well. There's something to be thankful for. But it's still pretty dear eating, but you could always eat well in Spain. That's what I really liked about it. You could, they knew how to eat, and the food wasn't too dear. I don't know what the problem is in France. It always puzzled me, because France is a country that's got about the same population as England, but it's got a much greater area of agricultural land available, so you'd think they'd be able to grow plenty of food to feed their population at a more economical price, but they can't. The English have got about 1/3 of the territory, but yet their food there is a lot cheaper, so it just must be that they're very inefficient. They only like to work for about half an hour every day and take 6 months. Well, what happened to me in France was the experience made me have a bit of sympathy with the Gestapo. I could understand the Gestapo after being in France. I didn't think they were such bad fellows then. Probably I'm wrong about that, but anyway, I really they did rather annoy me. But as for that tipping business, well, I hate tipping those people in places like Paris. You have to do it if you want a peaceful life. But they're so hungry about it that it's really repulsive. But on the other hand, in some places like in the poorer countries like Mexico and places like that, where the people are really poor, well, that's all they got the job for is for the tips, and they really do bend over backwards to give you good service without sort of making it too obvious, or they're philosophical about it. If they get the tip, they take it, and if they don't get it, they don't throw a tantrum. And they're in the hotels, there's a lady that comes in and makes your bed, and they're usually very nice. They clean up your room spotlessly, they smile at you, and they've generally got about 5 kids and an invalid husband to look after at home. I always tip them pretty generously, because that's all the income they've got, and they really do give something for it. But I have heard people say, why don't they form a union? But in some of those countries, you can't do that. If you try to form a union, well, they take you down to the creek and they shoot you, So some people, in some places, I find it necessary to tip. I use my discretion. In other places, I rather enjoy not giving it to them and watching them get enraged. So you've got to sort of know who needs it and who's just being greedy. They have both. Usually, they used to have both HF and 500 kilohertz. I don't think they have that anymore. I think they just stick to their HF, and they have low frequency receivers for receiving beacons, and the beacons relay what they're saying on the control tower and putting out on VHF. They're also putting that out on some beacons, so that if the VHF breaks down, they can still receive control tower instructions on another frequency and another receiver. So usually you found that aircraft equipment, even the wartime stuff, there were two sides to it. There was low frequency and high frequency, and for transmitting. Well, so anyway, it doesn't surprise me to discover that there are HF antenna tuners in aeroplanes. Actually, there's a lot of aeroplanes and a lot of radio equipment. A lot of it must turn up sooner or later. And I did read in the papers a couple of weeks ago where the Department of Defence is saying they're going to re-equip the Army with radio equipment. All the Army's radio equipment is going to get pitched out, and they're having a spring clean. They're re-equipping it all, so we can expect a flow of goodies onto the market very soon, I think. I'm waiting for that to happen. I don't know what will turn up, but anyway, something a little more modern than what's around at the moment. There are some fairly good things around. There's a transmitter that I've seen about. It's an English thing, and I think it's to be installed in a Land Rover. And it's got a big dial on it. It tunes from about 2 megs to 15, and it's a VFO, and it's nicely calibrated. But the thing that's wrong with it is, like a lot of that Army equipment, is that they design it so that even an idiot can use it, and they put the minimum number of knobs on it. So you've got this nice transmitter in a box, but when you go looking for the loading knobs for the capacitor to tune your dip and so on, you discover it's not there. They've got the tank circuits outboard. There's a thing that goes with this transmitter, and it's called the aerial, and it's bolted onto another part of the Land Rover, and it's got a box underneath it with a meter stuck on the front of it called tuning unit, and half the tank circuit's in there, so it's not in the transmitter, so you've got to find that, or else you've got to hang an outboard capacitor onto or something like that, and there's no room to stick it in there. It's jammed full of stuff anyway, so that's one of the problems with Army equipment, that you've got to find all the bits that go with it to make it work. I suppose you could find the antenna tuner or whatever they call it if you looked about, but that's what put me off that thing. I was going to buy one of those at one time. I think it was 40 dB or something like that.
but then I discovered that it didn't have enough knobs, and there was essential things were missing, and that they were in this outboard piece. Anyway, I think I heard you. Actually, incidentally, I heard your Big Ben clock going a couple of times. I think we had that happening another day. So you're picking up the clock, chiming the quarter hour or the half hour. That was the quarter hour. That's what it was chiming. Well, they won't let you pull them out of the boxes in the place where I was looking at them. One just happened to be half out. I wasn't able to examine it too closely, but the thing that struck me about it was that it looked beautifully made, but it didn't seem to have enough knobs on it. Now you tell me there's a receiver and everything in it, but it's FM. Is it entirely FM, or has it got AM modulator? I think if it's got a modulator, it's got to be a low-level modulator or else an outboard modulator. I wasn't sure about that. I'll have to go and have a look at one and inspect it more closely. I might get down to Richmond and see if they got any down there. Anyway, the one I saw, this was 6 months ago, was only 40 dB, so that wasn't too bad. It was quite cheap for what it was. But anyway, in their efforts to make the operation of these things simple, they seem to be doing away with what used to be considered to be essential controls. So, if you're having the book, I suppose you can look right into it. It's very good to have the book, but if you're about to buy something and then you've got to take it home and work out what it is afterwards, well, that's sort of pig in a poke and Russian roulette. Anyway, I like the idea of the sort of VFO that was built into it. That looked very good, and the inbuilt calibrator itself. There was certainly 40 dBs worth there. It looked like a good $40 worth to me. But anyway, I didn't at the time buy it. I bought this thing that I've got here instead, probably because I understood it better. It's more old-fashioned and if you could tell me something more about that C13, big semicircular dial on it. That's most attractive. It's got a knob to tune it. And it's only got about one other knob on it, or a couple of other knobs. It's got a switch. I seem to think if we're talking about the same thing, I seem to think the one that I saw didn't even have a knob to alter the gain of the receiver. That's what sort of convinced me there was no receiver in it, because it didn't seem to have any receiver controls. I seem to think the only control that it did have was the knob to turn the dial and one other switch, and that was about all. I may be wrong about that, but anyway, if you can describe it to me in a little more detail, Rodney, I'd be interested to hear. The thing is, you've got the book, you're the only person I know that has got the book. There have been some good things around. There was a little user that was selling for 20 dB and under recently, which was a sort of a power amplifier for a man.
How's the fuel crisis at the moment? It's quite bad, isn't it?
There's not many cars on the road. I think that's quite good. I don't think it's quite bad.
Yes, that's what I think. I think it's quite bad that society has come to develop around the car such that they depend on it.
Well, I have an entirely different opinion when I'm in a car. When I'm in a car, I change into a different person. But as a pedestrian, I find my whole attention's concentrated on dodging them, and it's been quite relaxing to walk down the street in the last couple of days and only see 3 cars in Glenferrie Road.
I think a petrol strike is very good as long as you've got petrol yourself.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. I'm sort of speaking facetiously because I'm just sitting at home. I haven't got the problems that other people have got. I imagine if you had to get to work or something like that and earn your money and depend on it and feed your family, well, it'd be quite frightening. But anyway, I'm not in that situation.
Well, that's right. In fact, I find driving a car such a pain, and in terms of in 20 minutes or so. It would take longer
on a push bike in the traffic, That's what I noticed. All the kids ride their push bikes on the pavement. When you're down shopping in Glenferrie Road, there's kids zooming up and down their bikes, and they nearly rip your leg open with their pedal. But then I think if I had a kid and he had a bike, I wouldn't want him to ride on the road either,
There is that. Although I've often thought in the city area, it's really ridiculous having... when you're a pedestrian or a cyclist, you think of that, but then I suppose when you're in a car, you think, isn't it nice and comfortable?
Yeah, well, yes, you do adopt a different attitude in a car. The last time I drove one was last week. I hired a truck from Budget, and I shifted a lot of rubbish from this house, and I found myself doing the same old things. You're sitting in the thing, and you get this
you get this sort of power complex, because all you've got to do to double your speed is push your foot down a bit harder. You forget the poor old pedestrian has got to walk, and you curse him because he's not on the pedestrian crossing, but you forget that it's an effort to walk the 100 yards to the pedestrian crossing and then up the other side of the road, you know.
Although I must say there's the other argument about pedestrians, which, like, I think it's quite easy to be a pedestrian and not get run over. If one uses...
well, I'm the living proof of that. I've been a pedestrian for a long time and I'm still alive. But there are some places where they don't cater for pedestrians. If you go down around the wharf, for example, and you can't get a taxi and you've got to walk from Flinders Street Extension to the wharf, well, they just don't cater for pedestrians. You're dodging heavy contraptions on wheels everywhere you go, you know. Now, that thing you're talking about, the narrow pavements, I noticed that in South American cities, the streets have been built for the horse and cart, and when the car came along, they jacked the roadway open by reducing the pavement to about 18 inches in width.
That's
and all
right.
the pedestrians are walking up and down there, and when it rains, it pours rain in some of those, and the gutters on the office buildings don't work. They're all fallen off or blocked up, so consequently you get a sheet of water like Niagara Falls pouring down the front of 8-storey office buildings.
Right.
You're on this 18-inch wide footpath underneath it, and the gutters on the streets don't work either, and you've got a lake 6 inches deep, and cars rushing up and down splashing you, and nobody gives a shit, you know. They just all go flat out, and you just get splattered left and right and from above as well.
In fact, there are a few lanes like that even in Melbourne.
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot of it everywhere. There's places everywhere where the car's taken over, you know, and it's not safe to walk anymore, but you seem to survive just the same. There have been some times in my life when I've been in these cities where the cars just want to run you down, you know, and when I've been walking around at night, I've filled my pockets with rocks, and if I can get a shot at them, well, I have. I mean, I've rushed up a side street, but I always had my escape route clear, you know, but I never hit many of them because it's very hard to hit a moving target like that, but I feel so angry that I want to do it, you know.
That's right. In fact, you end up in feuds like that when you ride a push bike these days, because the drivers think that you shouldn't be on the road, and if you ride on the pavement, the police book you for riding on
the Channel 7 in Dorcas
That's
Street,
right.
And I worked there for about 2 years, and I was just I was living in a thing which these days you would call it a commune, but then it was called a hostel, and it was in Brunswick Street, Fitzroy, on the corner of King William Street. The Divine Life Mission's in there now anyway, but in those days it used to be a university hostel, and then they gave it away, and it used to be a sort of place where you lived. Anyway, I lived there, and I worked at this place, and I was just doing a sort of an ordinary... I was just wiring switches and things together when I started there, and then I got to be chief of the amplifier production department. But in those days when I got there, the buyer himself had gone bankrupt.
Yeah.
He went to Surfers Paradise and started to run a motel. He didn't go that bankrupt, and they had the receivers in, and then eventually Roller took it over. When Roller took it over, they tried to introduce sort of Henry Ford production methods. Before that, all the amplifiers were sort of wired up by one person who knew how to wire, but when Roller got hold of it, they got production lines of sort of Greek ladies and Italian ladies there who were supposed to wire. It used to drive me bonkers because I was supposed to get them to do the same quality wiring that sort of professional wirers had been doing. It was really a false economy. It drove me out of the place in the end, but we used to have a bit of fun there. They used to have those TTC capacitors with an aluminium tube and with rubber bangs in the end. We used to take them out and wire up those penny, those firecrackers, what do they call them?
Penny bung.
The ones in a whole bunch. They were about an inch long. We used to
Tom
stick them in there with
Thumbs.
a bit of fuse wire and then wire them across the mains, sort of innocent looking, and then give them into the test department, and when they plugged them in, they all went off, you know, things like that. And then there used to be a bloke called Jim Dryden who was a storeman, and that was in the early days of TV, and all the TV personalities had Bias 66s and Bias 77s to hear themselves sing and to practice in. They had faults, and he'd pretend he didn't know who they were, and Graham Kennedy and this one, that one had come in, and he used to get his kicks by annoying them, by pretending not to recognise them. But there used to be a bloke there called Graham Thurkel, spelled Thirkell, and he was in the test department, and he now runs some kind of an electronic business. I think it's around Murrumbina or somewhere, I'm not sure. anyway, if you really wanted to get any bits, well, he'd be the bloke to ring up. He'd know where they all are, I would think.
That's very interesting. Yeah, because actually, were they still making the old grey bars when you worked there, or were they the silver ones?
No, they only made the 66 to 77, and then I think they made a stereo one, they called it the 88 or something, but it was a fairly limited range they were making, and I think they did have a little one that was like a butter box or a shoe box, but that had gone out of production before I got there.
Oh, yeah, because Dave and I have 77 Mark 1s, if you remember the thing.
Yeah, I remember them.
All cast aluminium deck and everything.
Yeah.
In fact, if you walked into my shack, you'd see 3 of them.
Have you got the whole thing? Have you got the tape deck, or have you got the amplifiers too?
I got the tape deck with the amplifiers in a sort of black case, so it stands with a 45-degree angle.
Yeah. It had quite a good setup there. The biggest part of it was the machine shop. You know, the mechanical side of it took up a lot more room in that factory than the wiring and testing side of it. They had a huge machine shop. They used to turn all that stuff up themselves. But
Yeah,
anyway, I suppose somebody in Japan makes a better one cheaper now. You'll never get that thing again in Australia.
That's right, because nowadays, if you tried to produce a thing like that, you'd probably go bankrupt before you
Well, that's
sold
exactly what they did. Yes, I think they did go bankrupt. It was really stupid. The bloke who was the manager down there and who introduced these Henry Ford methods, well, he got the axe in the end because he buggered everything up, and he ended up being executive in charge of the canteen at Roller or something. I'm trying to do something. I'm moving around the room. I'm trying to get away from the transistor radio, but the further away I get, the worse it gets. I think I might go to bed, actually, because this is sort of fouling up the whole contact, this feedback. I'll leave you to get on with it, and I'll have to get myself some kind of an FM receiver rigged up, I think.
You need to invest in a pair of cheap headphones.
Yeah,
actually.
that's all I need. Although that won't be too hard. Actually, I had the microphone jammed right into the speaker of the transistor, and it didn't give us much feedback as I would have. Yeah, all right. I better go to bed, I think. But anyway, if you're on the air tomorrow, for example, are you working tomorrow?
I'm working tomorrow, unfortunately.
You are you, Dave?
I saw on the ABC telly tonight, they closed down at 10. They said they were letting everyone go home on the tram or something.
Oh, yes.
Anyway, if you're around tomorrow on 160, I might have a word with you. But this crossband business will have to be improved, I think, because we can't go on all night with sort of screeches and feedback. So I'll say good night to everybody, and I'll pull out of it now and go to bed then.
Okay, then.
Good night, Jack.
Good night.
Anyway, with that remark, I shall leave you until next time. It's been a very interesting contact. It's very good, actually, to have this radio.